Hey, what's up, everybody? Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. So whether you want to optimize your investing plan, pay off student loans, or simply build a solid financial plan, YFP Planning will help get your income working for you rather than the other way around. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from Andrew in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Hi, this is Andrew, and I'm a pharmacist in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was wondering, when buying or refinancing, is it better to get a 15-year mortgage with a lower interest rate or a 30-year and pay more towards the principal?
Thank you, Andrew, for submitting your question to be featured on this week's Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think it's probably worth questioning like the entire premise in a sense. So I think you can make a pretty decent case that where interest rates are today, and what I did to prep for this question, Andrew, was kind of prepped a 15-year amortization schedule and a 30-year amortization schedule, just kind of, compare the two. Mm-hmm. But I used, again, just kind of looking at rates, I used like 2.25% for a 15-year and 3% for a 30-year. With the argument here is that, right now, you really shouldn't pay, from a mathematical perspective, you really shouldn't pay anything additional towards your mortgage. And the reason for that is that, if you use the opportunity cost comparing to putting that additional money into the market, you're going to do, in most cases, a lot better. So if we think about it in terms of historical market returns and rates of inflation, the market over a 30-year period on average will, return about 6-7% when you adjust it down for inflation, or 10% when you adjust it down for inflation at 6-7%. So if you compare that against, a 3% mortgage, then that mathematically makes sense to put the money into the market. Now, the emotional side for a lot of people is like, well, I want to own my home outright, and it's a feeling of security and that type of thing. So that to me holds a lot of weight for me, especially talking with clients. So I would say just think about that, and I'm sure you are. Think about that premise, just in general. So before we get into looking at kind of just the numbers, what I want to kind of go through is some of the pros and cons of the 15-year mortgage. And, typically the opposite would be true for the 30-year. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a 15-year, and I'm under the auspices of like, this is a fixed interest rate. We're not going to mess with a variable interest rate. But, for the pros of a 15-year fixed is that you definitely have a shorter path to own the house outright, right? So for a lot of people, again, it kind of goes back to that emotional, that security of like, if things happen, I still have a place to hang my hat, outside of paying the taxes and utilities and all that kind of stuff. But, I own my house. Mm-hmm. You build equity a lot faster because, you're putting a much bigger payment, and it's a lower interest rate. So the equity that you're going to build is going to be accelerated versus the 30-year. A lot of people view this as their house almost as a piggy bank, so they can leverage that for future things. So obviously that's a big component as well. The big disadvantage is that the payment's a lot bigger, Tim. So instead of paying, say, $1,500 as a payment, you might be paying $2,500. I wouldn't say it's quite double, but it would be a lot more out of pocket each month, which can hamper cash flow, right? So that's a big thing to consider. The other thing is what I kind of was alluding to earlier, which is what else could this money be doing, right? So if I can buy a house, a 30-year mortgage and pay $1,500, but now I'm paying an extra $1,000, what could I be doing with that $12,000 per year? And again, mathematically, it probably makes more sense over that 15-year period, if that's the delta in the stock market, because that's, historically from the 1880s, that's what the market has performed as. And then finally, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but because of the greater cash outflow, it might restrict you, the buyer, when you're looking at homes about what you can actually afford. So can you afford $1,500? Yes. Can you afford $2,500? Possibly no. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a good thing to be restricted because, as we've talked about in past episodes of the YFP podcast, is that home buying is very, very emotional. And you could say to me, and I've seen it a ton of times where you could say, Tim, I'm not going to pay any more than $350,000 for my house. And then we come back next meeting, it's like, I closed on the house $425. So it can be an emotional thing. So when I was kind of playing around with the amortization schedule, Tim, I just looked at a 15-year mortgage and a 30-year mortgage. I use for the 30-year 3%, which again, these are on the rise. But what I found, the biggest driver here is that the difference in the interest paid. So for a 30-year mortgage, the amount of interest that you're going to pay on a $350,000, that's what I use, a $350,000 house, 3%, where you're going to pay over that period of time is $180,000 in interest. So which is kind of crazy if you think about it. That's a big driver of like, okay, what's at stake here? If you compare that to a 15-year, 350,000, I'm using 2.25, you're only paying 62,000. So that's pretty significant. Now, again, the math will tell you that the money is still going to be better in the market in comparison, but we overlay that emotional side. So, Andrew, to answer your part more directly, do I do a 15-year with a lower interest rate, or do I do a 30-year and pay more towards the principal? Everyone can say with me, it depends, right? So, if your mission in life is for you and your family to pay off your house, then I often talk about this with student loans. Like if you are kind of hedging between, you say you have an aggressive strategy, Tim, and you're hedging between a 5-year term and a 7-year term to pay off your student loans, and your goal is to pay them off come hell or high water, then I would say do the 5-year, because if you give yourself the 7, you say, hey, I'm going to try to do it in 5. If you give yourself that rope, sometimes you hang yourself. So, but also like if that is the prior number one of 1, then like that's what you're going to focus on. That really is going to be the big thing is like, where does this fall in your hierarchy of goals? And if you're like, hey, it'd be nice to do it, then maybe you give yourself that rope, because other things could come up, especially if you have a family, things like that, if, depending on your employment situation. So, I always like to lock it in, but I also want to make sure that you're aware of the risk. And again, you can always refinance, which comes with extra transaction costs and maybe rates are different. But I think it really depends on what your goal is with the house. And for some people that evolves over time too. So, for me personally, talking about Tim Baker, not advice, I always just wanted to make sure that my house was paid off before I was going into retirement. I didn't even want to have to entertain the idea of saying, hey, I still have 25,000 or 50,000 on a mortgage when I'm 65 or 67, whenever to retire, because I don't want that to have any part in how I'm going to be living or things like that, or have to worry about it. So I think a lot of people look at that and will be like, well, I want to pay it off by the time I'm 50 or as soon as possible, but I'd rather just put my money elsewhere and diversify, maybe, smartly leverage myself so I can have, other properties and things like that. So it just goes back to that, what are you trying to do? How does the mortgage fit into the rest of your financial plan, et cetera? But I think it's a great question, because you're looking at a big transaction or a big part of your financial plan that a lot of people just, in my experience, will just default to the 30-year. And, depending on what your goals are and what your family's goals are, I think this is a question that can really, change, how you approach your financial future.
Yeah. And Tim, this is just another great example of why there is not a cookie cutter response that, has the same answer for 100 people that might be asking the same question, right? Because for Andrew specifically, there's at least 4 or 5 more questions that you'd want to ask and get to help then inform the answer to this question, right? And we talk about that all the time, that we can't be looking at these in a silo when we're looking at any part of the financial plan, because of things like cash flow, because of things like, hey, how do you feel about the debt? Because of things like, what's the opportunity cost and how else might we be using that money? And, even when you broke down that math, 180,000 in interest, 62,000 in interest, 30 versus 15, a lot of people look at that and say, end of conversation, I'm going to save money. Yeah. But they forget to do the math on, if I were to invest money elsewhere, right, with the asterisks and assumption that actually happens, then what does that mean? How do you weigh in? How does that weigh in? And how do you feel about it? So I think it's just it's a great question from Andrew, another great reminder of, making sure you're really not just looking at this one question, but really asking several other questions that are behind it. Because Tim, you gave your example about wanting to have the mortgage paid off by, I think you said by retirement. And you said some people might want it sooner. Some people might say, hey, let me keep taking that out as long as I possibly can at 3% or whatever the rate is, right? So
yeah, yeah, exactly right. And I think like a lot of people, when they pay their house off, they miss that tax,
Yep.
deduction. So there's and again, like it's not bad to aggressively retire debt. Again, I would say that some debt you should string out as long as possible just because of the number. But like I think that it goes back to also your risk is, if you retire a debt even at 2.25, that's an automatic return. And as we know with investments, we can look at trends in hundreds of years of data, but there's risk there.
Yeah.
You don't absolutely know. And again, I bank a lot on this historical data, but like you're automatically getting a 2.25 or a 3% return when you do that. And I think that's part of it too. Is just like what's your comfort with risk, and how do you view that? So yeah, it's going to be very much tailored to, again, goals, risk, all that kind of thing.
Great stuff, Tim. Andrew, appreciate the question. And I would point folks that are in the process of buying or refining a home. We've got some great resources, information about securing loans, refinancing, finding an agent, what's all involved in that process. You can go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, click on buy or refi a home, and you'll find more resources there. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast. If we feature your question on the show, we'll send you a super comfy YFP t-shirt. You can submit your question by sending an email to info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP. If you don't feel comfortable sharing your name on the show, you can send or record your question anonymously. As we conclude this week's Ask a YFP CFP episode, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this show. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of Your Financial Pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the podcast and have a great rest of your week.